Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. In the 1960s, there was a broad political movement taking shape in America called the New Left. This New Left was made up of activists that promoted a wide range of issues, including civil rights, the anti war movement, the abortion movement, the homosexual movement, and then the feminist movement. The foremost radical movement of the New Left was something called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. It was founded in 1960 at the University of Michigan. Soon, SDS spread to campuses all across America. SDS called for broad participatory democracy and was influenced by Marxism and other forms of socialism. Their manifesto was the Port Huron Statement, and it was authored by Tom Hayden. Now, SDS was mainly concerned with civil rights and the anti-war movement, but the organization was riddled with factionalism, and in June of 1969, it split into several factions. Some of these factions had strange names. One of them was called the Mother Effers and the Crazies. Another faction was called the Weatherman. These factions were very radical. In October 1969, the Weatherman orchestrated the 4 Days of Rage in Chicago, where they just basically went on a rampage and trashed Chicago. In the end, almost 300 radicals were arrested. Between 1969 and 1970, New Left radicals set off over 250 bombs throughout the United States. They generally targeted government buildings, ROTC buildings, draft boards, and induction centers. In March of 1970, 3 members of the Weatherman killed themselves accidentally while building bombs in Greenwich Village. After the collapse of SDS, many went on to be radical community organizers or college professors. Now, one of the biggest cultural movements in the 60s and 70s was the women's movement. Now, this women's movement was different than previous generations of women's movements. Previous generations had worked for things such as the right to vote, protective legislation, and equal pay for equal work. The women's movement of the 60s and 70s became more about women's liberation, which focused on issues such as abortion, national child care, and women in the workforce. Feminists of the women's liberation bent were younger, college-educated women who grew up in the post-World War II world. Their progressive parents and grandparents had lived through the fight to give women the right to vote in the early 1900s, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. They were more conservative, seeing women's role as complementary to a man's role. But to contrast with that, the women's liberation movement came of age during the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Now, one of the biggest feminist battles of the 1970s was over the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed in 1923. It affirmed, quote, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Now, the women's movement was divided on whether or not they should support the ERA. They were split during the 1920s all the way through the 60s and then even during the 1970s. Now, on one hand, some women, such as Alice Paul, claimed that the ERA would lift women up to the rightful place alongside men. Other women feared it would set women back. The progressive movement had been successful during the early 1900s in gaining protective legislation for women. This was legislation that prevented women from being exploited on the job. It set maximum working hours for women on the job. It outlawed night work for women, and it prevented women from doing work that was considered strenuous enough that only men could perform it. And many liberal women, such as Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. Perkins believed that, quote, "Legal equality between the sexes is not possible because men and women are not identical in physical structure or social function, and therefore their needs cannot be identical." Frida Miller, head of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor, denounced the ERA as, quote, "radical, dangerous, and irresponsible." And one Women's Bureau official memo said that that ERA supporters were, quote, "a small but militant group of leisure class women venting their resentment of not having been born men." So basically, liberal and progressive women from the 1900s up until the 1950s and 60s, they tend to oppose the ERA because they believe that women are different than men and therefore they have different roles in society. That's a broad statement. It's not true of everyone, but it's generally true of the movement. Then in the 1960s and 70s, the women movement starts to become more about men and women are the same, they're no different. They can do the exact same types of jobs with the exact same types of results. So there's kind of this split within the women's movement. Now, the ERA passed the Senate in the 1940s and 50s, but it never passed the House of Representatives. Even in the 1960s, there's opposition to the ERA from liberal quarters. JFK named Eleanor Roosevelt to head a presidential commission on the status of women, which released a report in 1963. It did a number of things. It called for training for young women that would help them prepare for marriage. This commission declared that motherhood was the major role of women, and this commission also opposed the ERA, so Eleanor Roosevelt opposes the ERA. Now, just because the ERA was opposed by most Americans doesn't mean there wasn't legislative action taken regarding women. JFK issued an executive order ending sex discrimination in the federal civil service, and in 1963, JFK signed the Equal Pay Act, which guaranteed women equal pay for equal work. So it's illegal to pay. It is illegal today to pay women different pay than men for the same work, and that goes back to a law signed by JFK. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, things are changing. The National Organization for Women is founded in 1966. NOW's purpose was to, quote, bring women into full participation in American society, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof, ensure equal partnership with men. NOW's first president was Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminist Mystique. Friedan's book attacked suburban domesticity and persuaded women that self-realization was possible through education, jobs, and escape from domesticity. And under Friedan's leadership, NOW grew to a membership of 15,000 by the early 1970s. NOW endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment and pushed for its adoption. And in early 1972, both houses of Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment by overwhelming majorities. It required ratification by 38 states, and by mid-1973, 28 states had done so. And then by 1974, 34 states had ratified the ERA. And then in 1977, Indiana ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, so the total is 35, so they only need 3 more states to amend the Constitution. But that's where ERA was stopped dead in its tracks by Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly was a lawyer and kind of a conservative activist, and in 1972, she founded the National Committee to Stop ERA. Schlafly began a grassroots movement that stopped ERA short of the 38 states needed for ratification, and she actually got a number of states to rescind their ratification. Schlafly and many conservative women believe that ERA would create this unisex society and take away many of the rights and privileges that women enjoyed. One of their biggest concerns was that women would be drafted in the military if ERA was passed. And if the Equal Rights Amendment really is about true equality, then women would be required to be drafted. Schlafly explained her opposition this way. She would often say, why would a woman give up the best parts about being a woman, such as having a man provide for her, raising her children, having the option to stay at home, for the worst parts about being a man or going to war? That's how Schlafly voiced her opposition to ERA. Now, Congress did extend the deadline for ratification to 1982, but the Equal Rights Amendment was never ratified. Now, another big issue for feminism in the 1960s and 70s was abortion, which became a hot-button topic that's still controversial to this day. Previous generations of women in the women's movements had opposed abortion. Alice Paul, who's generally considered kind of the most radical supporter of women's rights during the early 1900s, she said that, quote, abortion is the greatest in the exploitation of women. But women of the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s were different than the generation of Alice Paul, and the Supreme Court is who ultimately legalized abortion, not the people of the United States through their legislative process. Now, in 1965, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in the case Griswold v. Connecticut They struck down a law that outlawed contraceptives. They declared that this violated a person's constitutional right to privacy. And then less than 10 years later, in 1973, they handed down their decision legalizing abortion in Roe v. Wade. This was a 7-2 ruling. There was another case called Doe v. Bolton that was kind of a companion case to Roe v. Wade. So those two cases kind of legalized abortion. In Roe v. Wade, it was ruled that abortion could not be forbidden in the first trimester, while there could be restrictions in the second and third trimester. The court held that a woman could get an abortion because it's a private undertaking protected by the Constitution. Roe and Dole struck down Texas and Georgia laws against abortion. In the Roe in Roe v. Wade was a woman named Norma McCorvey. She was a woman in her 20s who was pregnant with her third child. She tried to get an abortion, but it was illegal in Texas, so she couldn't. With the help of women's rights lawyers, she challenged the abortion restrictions in Texas, and she lied and said that her pregnancy was the result of a gang rape. So that's kind of how she made her case more appealing to the lawyers and to the court system. Henry Wade was the Dallas County District Attorney, and he represented the state of Texas. Now, McCorvey didn't really take parts in the legal proceedings, and she never attended a single trial hearing. And in an ironic twist, McCorvey gave birth to her child she was suing to be able to legally abort, and she later put that child up for adoption. In the Doe v. Bolton case, Sandra Cano was the Doe. She lived in Georgia and had 3 children. She became pregnant with her 4th child, and she actually wanted to divorce her husband and get legal custody of her children. So she went to a lawyer, but this lawyer actually filed for her to get an abortion and to strike down the Georgia laws against abortion. Cano later said that the lawyer forged her signature on legal documents. Cano never appeared in court either. A man named Arthur Bolton was the Georgia Attorney General. And both women, McCorvey and Cano, later became pro-life advocates later in their life, and they said that they believed it was a mistake to legalize abortion. So both women kind of changed their minds later in life. Sexual values were also changing during the 1960s and 70s. The percentage of people who believed in premarital sex was wrong, declined. More and more people engage in that. In the 1950s and earlier, it was generally considered it's a good thing to get married before you have sex or have a family. And then in the 1960s and 70s, that starts to change. Views on homosexuality also begin to change. In June of 1969, something called the Stonewall Riot occurred in Greenwich Village in New York. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar that was raided by police. This was followed by 5 days of rioting. Elements of the New Left began to advocate for gay rights, and other organizations followed them. In 1973, the National Organization for Women endorsed gay rights. In 1974, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of disorders. So sexual values changed throughout the 1960s and 70s. Environmentalism is another big movement. Environmentalists stated their goals included more outdoor recreation, protecting public health, reducing pollution, stopping the atomic testing, protecting endangered animals and species, regulating development, slowing down population growth or even limiting population growth. Rachel Carson helped ignite the environmentalist movement in 1962 with her book Silent Spring, in which she warned about the pollutants being used in the environment, especially the pesticide DDT. DDT was this pesticide that was used to kill things like mosquitoes. Congress banned DDT in 1972. Ralph Nader was another kind of environmentalist or consumer advocate who attacked things like General Motors for creating cars that were just gas guzzlers and bad for the environment. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich, a biology professor, published a very popular book called The Population Bomb. He predicted that hundreds of millions of people would starve during the 1970s and 80s. Barry Commoner, also a biology professor, predicted coming nuclear disaster. He was called the Paul Revere of Ecology by Time magazine. He published a book called The Closing Circle, which warned about environmental pollution. The Club of Rome, which is this loose association of scientists, They published something in 1972 called The Limits to Growth, and this predicted that the world would self-destruct by the year 2000. So there's a lot of doomsdayers in the environmental movement of the 1970s, 1960s, and 70s. But numerous laws are passed during the 60s and 70s, so environmentalism does win a lot of adherents. Here's a list of all the laws passed during the 1960s and 70s. This isn't all of them, but this is many of them. So you can see there's a lot of activity on the environmental front during the 60s and 70s. Now, a lot of people were opposed to the environmental movement. They claimed that environmentalists were growing the size of government and putting things like animals and nature ahead of people. You know, numerous construction jobs, for example, never happened because environmentalists created too many bureaucratic barriers for them to take place. Other people pointed to the mass hysteria caused by Paul Ehrlich's predictions, which turned out to be false. More seriously, millions of more people became infected by malaria because of Rachel Carson's crusade against DDT. DDT was used to kill mosquitoes, and many places in the third world had succeeded in drastically reducing the number of people infected with malaria thanks to their use of DDT. But after Carson's crusade, malaria infections and deaths shot up because less and less DDT was being used. Things like Earth Day also popped up during the 1970s. So a lot of environmentalism, but that's kind of a little bit about the New Left. Next time we'll look at Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and we'll get into the 1980s.